The Duke of Ashford had always prided himself on his impeccable judgment of character. For 3 years, he had courted Lady Rosalind Fairmont, the embodiment of grace and virtue, the woman who would stand beside him as Duchess. Their engagement was the talk of London society, a perfect union between two illustrious families. But on a warm June evening in 1815, as he walked through the moonlit gardens of Fairmont House, he overheard a conversation that would shatter every illusion he had carefully constructed. Behind the rose arbor, Rosalind's voice carried on the night air, dripping with contempt as she mocked his late mother's common origins and revealed a scheme so calculating, so devoid of the love he believed they shared, that his world tilted on its axis. The woman he thought he knew had never existed at all. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it's traveled. The spring of 1815 brought with it a season of unprecedented splendor to London. The war with France had finally ended, and society threw itself into celebration with a fervor that bordered on desperation, as if determined to forget the years of anxiety and loss. Amid this glittering whirlwind stood Alexander Thornbury, the 7th Duke of Ashford, a man of 28, whose dark hair and striking blue eyes made him the subject of countless whispers among the unmarried ladies of the ton. Yet Alexander's heart had been claimed 3 years prior, during his first season after assuming the dukedom following his father's death. Lady Rosalind Fairmont had captivated him at a ball at Devonshire House, her golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets, her porcelain complexion luminous in the candlelight, her manners so refined that she seemed to float rather than walk across the ballroom floor. She was the daughter of the Earl of Fairmont, a family whose lineage stretched back to the Norman conquest, and she possessed every quality a duchess should embody: beauty, breeding, and an unimpeachable reputation. Their courtship had been conducted with all the propriety that society demanded. Chaperoned walks in Hyde Park, carefully orchestrated meetings at soirees and musicales, letters exchanged under the watchful eyes of Lady Fairmont. Alexander had been patient, methodical even in his pursuit. He was not a man given to impulsive emotion. His father had taught him that a duke's marriage was a matter of dynasty, not merely personal preference. Yet he had convinced himself that in Rosalind he had found both, a woman who would elevate the Ashford name while also providing the companionship he secretly craved. The engagement had been announced 6 months ago, in October of 1814, at a lavish ball hosted by the Fairmonts at their Mayfair residence. Alexander could still recall the moment he had slipped the Ashford sapphire, a ring that had graced the fingers of duchesses for 5 generations, onto Rosalind's delicate hand. She had gazed up at him with those luminous green eyes, her expression one of demure pleasure, and murmured her acceptance with a voice like honey. The assembled guests had applauded, champagne had flowed like water, and Alexander had felt, for the first time since his father's death, that he was fulfilling his duty in a way that might also bring him happiness. Now, as June arrived with its warm breezes and abundant roses, the wedding loomed just 3 weeks away. The preparations had consumed the Fairmont household entirely. Lady Fairmont, a formidable woman with iron-grey hair and a personality to match, had taken command of every detail with military precision. The ceremony would take place at St. George's, Hanover Square, followed by a wedding breakfast for 300 guests at Ashford House. Rosalind's trousseau had been assembled from the finest modistes in London, her wedding gown a confection of Brussels lace and silk that had required 6 seamstresses working for 2 months. Alexander's own preparations had been less elaborate, but no less significant. He had spent considerable time with his solicitors, ensuring that the marriage settlements were generous and that Rosalind would be well provided for should anything happen to him. He had also begun the process of renovating the Duchess's apartments at Ashford House, which had stood empty since his mother's death 5 years earlier. The rooms were being redecorated in shades of cream and gold, colours he believed would suit Rosalind's delicate beauty. His mother. The thought of her brought a familiar ache to his chest. Catherine Thornbury had been a remarkable woman, intelligent, compassionate, and possessed of a quiet strength that had been the foundation of their family. She had died of a fever when Alexander was 23, and he still missed her counsel, particularly now, as he prepared to take a wife. He wondered what she would have thought of Rosalind, whether she would have approved of his choice. "Your Grace, the carriage is ready." His butler, Morrison, appeared in the doorway of the study where Alexander had been reviewing correspondence. The older man's face was impassive, as always, but there was a warmth in his eyes. Morrison had served the Ashford family for 40 years and had known Alexander since he was in leading strings. "Thank you, Morrison. I shall be down directly." Alexander set aside the letter he had been reading, a note from his aunt in Derbyshire, expressing her delight at the upcoming nuptials, and rose from his desk. He was expected at Fairmont House for dinner, an intimate family affair that Lady Fairmont had insisted upon. "Just the immediate families," she had said, though Alexander suspected her definition of intimate would still involve at least 20 guests. The journey from Ashford House in Grosvenor Square to the Fairmont residence in Berkeley Square took less than 10 minutes, but Alexander found himself oddly reluctant as the carriage rolled through the streets. He could not identify the source of his unease. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. Rosalind was everything he had wanted in a wife. The marriage would strengthen both families' positions in society. There was no rational reason for the vague sense of disquiet that had been growing in him over the past few weeks. Perhaps it was merely the natural anxiety of a man about to surrender his bachelor freedom. His friend, Viscount Hartley, had warned him about such feelings. "Cold feet, old boy," Hartley had said over brandy at White's the previous week. "Perfectly normal. Every man feels it before he takes the plunge. You'll be right as rain once the deed is done." The carriage drew to a halt before the imposing facade of Fairmont House, its white Portland stone gleaming in the evening light. A footman hurried forward to open the door, and Alexander stepped down onto the pavement. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing the Fairmont's butler, a thin man with a perpetually disapproving expression. "Good evening, Your Grace." "The family is gathered in the drawing-room." Alexander handed over his hat and gloves, then made his way up the curved staircase to the first floor. The sound of conversation and laughter drifted from the drawing-room, and he paused for a moment outside the door, composing his features into an expression of pleasant anticipation. When he entered, all eyes turned toward him. Lady Fairmont rose from her position near the fireplace, her smile gracious, but her eyes calculating as always. "Your Grace, how delightful! We were just speaking of you." "Nothing too scandalous, I hope," Alexander replied with practiced charm, bowing over her extended hand. "Only the most flattering observations, I assure you." She gestured toward the assembled company. Besides the Earl and Countess, there were several other guests. Rosalind's younger sister, Lady Charlotte, a pretty girl of 19 with her sister's colouring, but none of her refinement. Rosalind's brother, Viscount Pemberton, a dissolute young man whom Alexander privately considered a wastrel, and several cousins and aunts, whose names Alexander could never quite remember. And there, seated on a settee near the window, was Rosalind herself. She looked exquisite in a gown of pale blue silk, her hair dressed with pearl combs, her posture perfect. When she saw him, she smiled, that same serene, measured smile she always wore, and extended her hand. "Alexander," she murmured as he bent over her fingers, "I'm so pleased you could join us." "I would not miss it for the world," he replied, and meant it. Whatever his vague unease, he could not deny that Rosalind was beautiful, accomplished, and entirely suitable. Dinner was announced shortly thereafter, and they processed into the dining room in order of precedence. Alexander, as the highest-ranking gentleman present, escorted Lady Fairmont, while the Earl took in Rosalind. The meal was elaborate, course after course of rich French cuisine, accompanied by wines from the Fairmont cellars. The conversation flowed around topics deemed appropriate for mixed company: the upcoming Royal Ascot races, the latest exhibition at the Royal Academy, speculation about which families would retire to their country estates once the season ended. Alexander found himself watching Rosalind throughout the meal. She ate sparingly, as was proper for a lady, and contributed to the conversation with well-timed observations that were neither too bold nor too retiring. She was, he reflected, absolutely perfect in every way. So why did he feel as though he were observing a performance rather than engaging with a real person? The thought unsettled him, and he pushed it aside. He was being ridiculous. Rosalind was exactly what she appeared to be, a gently bred lady of impeccable character. His doubts were merely the product of pre-wedding nerves, nothing more. After dinner, the ladies withdrew, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars. The conversation turned to politics and business, topics that Alexander found more engaging than the social pleasantries of the dinner table. Yet even as he discussed the implications of the Corn Laws with Lord Fairmont, part of his mind remained elsewhere, troubled by thoughts he could not quite articulate. When they rejoined the ladies in the drawing-room, Lady Fairmont suggested that Rosalind might favour them with a performance on the pianoforte. Rosalind demurred with becoming modesty before allowing herself to be persuaded, and soon the room was filled with the delicate strains of a Mozart sonata. She played competently, though without particular passion, her fingers moving precisely across the keys. As the evening drew to a close and Alexander prepared to take his leave, Rosalind walked with him to the entrance hall, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I'm so looking forward to our wedding day," she said softly, her green eyes meeting his, "to finally beginning our life together." "As am I," Alexander replied, and raised her hand to his lips. "Sleep well, my dear." As his carriage carried him back through the darkening streets toward Ashford House, Alexander stared out the window at the passing houses, each one lit from within by candlelight. In 3 weeks, Rosalind would be his wife, the Duchess of Ashford. It was everything he had planned for, everything that was expected of him. So why did he feel as though he were walking toward a cage rather than a future? The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of final fittings, last-minute arrangements, and social obligations. Alexander found himself caught in a whirlwind of activity that left little time for introspection, which was perhaps a blessing. His doubts, he told himself firmly, were nothing more than the natural trepidation of a man about to make the most significant commitment of his life. The evening before the wedding, Lady Fairmont had organized what she termed a modest gathering at Fairmont House, a pre-wedding celebration for the couple's closest friends and family. In reality, the event had swelled to include nearly 200 guests, all of London's most prominent families eager to witness the final social triumph before the ceremony itself. Alexander arrived at 8 o'clock, dressed in formal evening attire, his cravat tied in the intricate mathematical style that his valet had spent 20 minutes perfecting. The house blazed with light from every window, and the sound of music and conversation spilled out into Berkeley Square. Footmen lined the entrance, and inside, the rooms had been decorated with thousands of white roses and trailing ivy, creating an atmosphere of ethereal beauty. He was immediately swept into the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations from what seemed like every person in attendance. Lord Hartley clapped him on the shoulder with rather too much enthusiasm. "Your last night of freedom, Ashford. Make the most of it." Several other gentlemen laughed, though Alexander noticed that their wives shot them disapproving glances. Rosalind stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a coterie of admiring friends. She wore a gown of ivory silk embroidered with silver thread, and diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, the Fairmont diamonds, which would soon be replaced by the Ashford jewels. When she caught sight of Alexander, she smiled and beckoned him over with a graceful gesture. "There you are, my dear Duke," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of affectionate formality. "I was beginning to think you had changed your mind." "Never," Alexander replied, bowing over her hand. The assembled ladies tittered appreciatively at this display of devotion. Lady Charlotte stood at her sister's elbow, her expression one of barely concealed envy. She had been particularly attentive to Alexander throughout the courtship, often inserting herself into conversations and finding excuses to be present during his visits. Alexander had always maintained a polite distance, but he could not help noticing the calculating gleam in her eyes whenever she looked at him. "Shall we dance?" Rosalind asked, and Alexander led her onto the floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. They moved together with practiced ease, having danced together countless times over the past 3 years. Rosalind's hand rested lightly in his, her steps perfectly timed to the music. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Alexander asked quietly as they turned. "Should I be?" Rosalind's smile was serene. "I have been preparing for this my entire life, Alexander. To be your Duchess is the culmination of everything I have worked toward." There was something in her phrasing that struck him as odd, worked toward rather than hoped for or dreamed of. But before he could examine the thought further, the dance ended, and they were immediately surrounded by well-wishers once more. The evening progressed with speeches and toasts. Lord Fairmont spoke at length about the honor of uniting their 2 great families. Alexander's uncle, the Bishop of Winchester, who would perform the ceremony, offered blessings for their future happiness. Through it all, Alexander smiled and nodded and played his part, even as that strange sense of unease continued to grow in the pit of his stomach. It was nearly midnight when Alexander decided he needed a moment of respite from the oppressive heat and noise of the ballroom. He made his way through the crowd toward the French doors that led to the gardens, nodding politely at those who tried to engage him in conversation, but not stopping. The cool night air was a relief after the stifling atmosphere inside, and he drew in a deep breath, feeling some of the tension ease from his shoulders. The Fairmont Gardens were extensive, stretching back from the house in a series of terraced levels adorned with classical statuary and carefully manicured hedges. Lanterns had been hung along the main paths, casting pools of golden light, but Alexander moved away from these, seeking the darker, quieter areas where he might have a few moments of solitude. He found himself walking toward the rose arbor at the far end of the garden, a secluded spot surrounded by climbing roses that filled the air with their heavy perfume. The sounds of the party faded to a distant murmur, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a nightingale. It was then that he heard voices, low and conspiratorial, coming from the other side of the arbor. He was about to turn away, not wishing to intrude on what was clearly a private conversation, when he heard his own name spoken. "Cannot believe Rosalind actually managed to trap the Duke of Ashford." The voice was female, young, and filled with malicious amusement. Alexander recognized it immediately. Lady Charlotte. He froze, his hand gripping the edge of a stone bench. "Oh, Charlotte, you must give your sister more credit." This second voice was also familiar, Lady Beatrice Wentworth, one of Rosalind's closest friends, a sharp-tongued woman whom Alexander had never particularly liked. "She has played this game brilliantly from the very beginning. 3 years of perfect behavior, never a foot wrong. The Duke never stood a chance. But does she even love him?" Charlotte's voice held a note of genuine curiosity. "She has never spoken of him with any real affection. It is always the Duke this and His Grace that, as if he were a title rather than a man." "Love?" Beatrice laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the night air. "My dear Charlotte, love has nothing to do with it. Your sister wants to be a duchess, and Ashford was the most eligible duke available. She would have married the devil himself if he came with a coronet." Alexander felt as though he had been struck. His heart hammered in his chest, and he knew he should walk away, should not listen to any more of this poisonous gossip. Yet he remained rooted to the spot, unable to move. "I suppose you are right," Charlotte said, and there was a petulant note in her voice now. "Though I do not see why she should have him. I am prettier than Rosalind, and younger too. If only I had been out in society when he first appeared, I might have caught his eye instead." Perhaps," Beatrice replied, her tone suggesting she doubted this very much. But Rosalind had the advantage of being the elder daughter, and she used it well. "Do you know what she told me last week? She said that once she is Duchess, she will finally be able to live as she pleases, no more pretending to enjoy his tedious conversation about estate management and politics, no more feigning interest in his charitable works. She plans to establish herself in London while he rustles about in the country with his farms and his tenants." "And what of providing an heir?" Charlotte asked. "Oh, she will do her duty in that regard, I am sure. 1 or 2 sons to secure the succession, and then separate bedrooms and separate lives. It is how all the best marriages are conducted after all." Alexander's hands had clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. The pain was distant, insignificant compared to the anguish that was tearing through his chest, but it was Rosalind's own voice, joining the conversation, that delivered the final, devastating blow. "Are you two gossiping about me?" She sounded amused rather than offended. "I could hear you from the path. Really, you must learn to be more discreet." "Rosalind," Charlotte's voice held a note of alarm. "We were just discussing my impending triumph?" "Yes, I heard." Now there was a rustling of silk as Rosalind presumably sat down on the bench on the other side of the arbour. "And you are quite right, Beatrice. Tomorrow I become the Duchess of Ashford, and all of this tiresome pretense will finally be over. Do you truly not care for him at all?" This was Charlotte again, and Alexander could hear something almost like pity in her voice. "Care for him?" Rosalind's laugh was cold, utterly unlike the warm, gentle sounds she made in his presence. "He is a means to an end, nothing more. A rather dull means, if I'm honest. Do you know he actually wanted to discuss his mother with me last week? That woman with her common blood and her ridiculous notions about educating the poor." I had to sit there and nod sympathetically while he waxed poetic about her virtues. It was all I could do not to yawn in his face. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. His mother, his beloved mother, whom he had cherished above all others, dismissed so casually, so cruelly. The woman he had thought he loved, the woman he was to marry in less than 12 hours, had been mocking him, mocking his mother's memory all along. "The important thing," Rosalind continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "is that after tomorrow I will have everything I have always wanted. The title, the jewels, the position in society, Ashford House in London, the estate in Derbyshire, the income of 20,000 a year. And all I had to do was pretend to be the perfect demure lady for 3 years. Really, it was almost too easy. Men are such fools when it comes to a pretty face and proper manners." "And if he discovers the truth?" Beatrice asked. "If he realizes you have been deceiving him?" "He won't." Rosalind's confidence was absolute. "He sees what he wants to see, a biddable wife who will grace his table and bear his children and never challenge him. And that is what I shall appear to be, at least in public. What I do in private, once I have secured my position, is my own affair." There was more. Something about a gentleman named Captain Rothwell, whom Rosalind apparently found far more interesting than her betrothed, but Alexander had heard enough, more than enough. He turned and walked swiftly back toward the house, his mind reeling, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him like a house built on sand. The woman he had courted for 3 years, the woman he had believed to be the embodiment of grace and virtue, was a fraud. Every smile, every gentle word, every appearance of affection had been a calculated performance designed to trap him into marriage. And he, fool that he was, had walked willingly into her snare. He reached the ballroom in a daze, barely aware of his surroundings. The music and laughter that had seemed merely loud before now felt like a physical assault. He needed to leave, needed to think, needed to decide what to do with this devastating knowledge. But before he could make his escape, Lady Fairmont appeared at his elbow, her face wreathed in smiles. "Your Grace, there you are. We are about to cut the cake. You and Rosalind must do the honours together." Alexander looked past her and saw Rosalind entering from the garden, Charlotte and Beatrice trailing behind her. She looked serene, beautiful, every inch the perfect bride-to-be. When her eyes met his across the room, she smiled. That same gentle, loving smile she had given him 1,000 times before. And in that moment, Alexander knew exactly what he had to do. The clock in the entrance hall of Fairmont House struck 1 in the morning as Alexander stood before the assembled guests, his hand resting on the hilt of the silver cake knife. Rosalind stood beside him, her fingers barely touching his arm, her expression one of radiant happiness that he now recognized as utterly false. The crowd had gathered in a semicircle around them, champagne glasses raised, faces flushed with wine and anticipation. Lady Fairmont beamed at them from the front of the crowd. "A toast," she called out, "to the future Duke and Duchess of Ashford. May tomorrow bring the beginning of a long and happy union." "Hear, hear!" The chorus of voices echoed through the room. Alexander looked down at Rosalind, at her perfect features and calculating green eyes, and felt a cold clarity settle over him. He set down the knife with deliberate precision. "I am afraid," he said, his voice cutting through the celebratory noise with the sharpness of a blade, "that there will be no wedding tomorrow." The silence that fell was absolute. 200 people seemed to stop breathing simultaneously. Rosalind's smile froze on her face, her eyes widening in shock. "Alexander!" Her voice was uncertain, still trying to maintain the facade. "What are you saying? Is this some sort of jest?" "No jest, Lady Rosalind." He emphasized her title, stripping away the intimacy of her given name. "I am saying that I cannot marry a woman who holds me in contempt, who has spent 3 years deceiving me, and who mocks the memory of my mother in private while pretending devotion in public." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Lady Fairmont's face had gone white, then red. "Your Grace, you are overwrought. Perhaps the excitement of the day—" "I am perfectly composed, Lady Fairmont." Alexander's voice was ice. "I overheard a most illuminating conversation in your gardens this evening, one in which your daughter revealed her true nature and her true intentions. I will not repeat the details here out of respect for those present, but I assure you that I am quite certain of what I heard." Rosalind's composure cracked. "You were eavesdropping. How dare you? How dare I?" Alexander's laugh was bitter. "How dare you, madam, spend 3 years playing a role designed to trap me into a loveless marriage? How dare you speak of my mother, a woman worth 10 of you, with such casual cruelty?" Charlotte had gone pale, her hand pressed to her mouth. Beatrice Wentworth had quietly tried to slip toward the door, but the crowd was too thick. Lord Fairmont stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "This is outrageous. You cannot publicly humiliate my daughter in this manner. The contracts are signed, the settlements agreed upon. You will honor your commitment, sir, or face the consequences." "The contracts," Alexander said coldly, "contain a clause regarding fraud and misrepresentation. I believe my solicitors will find that Lady Rosalind's deliberate deception constitutes grounds for nullification. As for consequences, I am prepared to face whatever society may say. I will not, however, bind myself for life to a woman who views me as nothing more than a title and an income." He removed the Ashford sapphire from Rosalind's finger. She was too shocked to resist, and placed it on the table beside the untouched cake. Then he turned to address the stunned assembly. "I apologize to those of you who have traveled to London for tomorrow's ceremony. The wedding will not take place. I bid you all good evening." He walked through the crowd, which parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. Behind him, he could hear Lady Fairmont's voice rising in shrill protest. Rosalind's sobs, real or performed, he no longer cared, and the excited buzz of 200 voices all speaking at once. By morning, the scandal would be all over London. By afternoon, it would have reached every corner of England. Alexander did not care. He had spent his entire life doing what was expected, what was proper, what would uphold the dignity of his position, and it had nearly led him to a lifetime of misery with a woman who despised him. The night air was cool on his face as he climbed into his carriage. "Ashford House," he told his coachman, then changed his mind. "No, take me to Lady Pemberton's residence in Bloomsbury." His aunt, Lady Agatha Pemberton, was his mother's elder sister, and the only family member with whom Alexander felt he could be completely honest. She was a widow of independent means, and even more independent spirit. A woman who had scandalized society 30 years ago by refusing to remarry after her husband's death, and instead dedicating herself to intellectual pursuits and charitable works. She lived in a comfortable townhouse in Bloomsbury, surrounded by books and interesting people, and had always told Alexander that he was welcome at any hour. It was nearly 2 in the morning when he knocked on her door. The elderly butler who answered looked startled but not displeased to see him. "Your Grace, Lady Pemberton is still awake, reading in her study. Shall I announce you?" "No need, Perkins. I know the way." He found his aunt exactly where Perkins had said she would be, seated in a leather chair beside a roaring fire, a book open on her lap, and her spectacles perched on her nose. She was a handsome woman of 55, with silver hair and the same blue eyes that Alexander had inherited from his mother. She looked up as he entered, and her expression immediately shifted from surprise to concern. "Alexander, what has happened?" And suddenly, the careful control he had maintained throughout the evening shattered. He sank into the chair opposite hers and told her everything. The overheard conversation, the cruel mockery, the public dissolution of his engagement. The words poured out of him in a torrent, and Agatha listened without interruption, her face growing grimmer with each revelation. When he finally fell silent, she set aside her book and regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and approval. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. "I know it does not feel that way at present, but you did. Better to endure scandal now than a lifetime of unhappiness." "I was such a fool," Alexander said, his voice raw. 3 years, Aunt Agatha. 3 years of courtship, and I never saw through her performance. What does that say about my judgment?" "It says that you are a decent man who expects decency in others," Agatha replied. "Lady Rosalind is clearly an accomplished actress. You are not the first man to be deceived by a beautiful face and pretty manners, and you will not be the last. The important thing is that you discovered the truth before it was too late. Society will crucify me for this, breaking an engagement the night before the wedding." "Society," Agatha said with considerable scorn, "is composed largely of hypocrites and fools. Those whose opinions matter will understand that you acted with integrity. The rest can gossip all they like. You are the Duke of Ashford, Alexander. You do not need society's approval to live your life." Alexander managed a weak smile. "You sound like Mother. Your mother was the wisest woman I ever knew. I only wish she were here now to tell you herself." Agatha leaned forward, her expression intent. "Listen to me, my dear boy. You are going to leave London. Today rather, since it is already past midnight. You will go to Ashford Park and stay there until this scandal has died down. And while you are there, you will remember who you are. Not a title, not a matrimonial prize, but a man of intelligence and principle. You will rediscover yourself, away from the suffocating expectations of the ton." "Run away, you mean?" Alexander said bitterly. "Retreat strategically," Agatha corrected. "There is a difference. You have dealt Lady Rosalind and her family a blow from which their reputation may never recover. They will be vicious in their attempts to salvage the situation, to paint you as the villain in this piece. Better to be absent while the initial fury burns itself out." She was right, of course. She usually was. Alexander nodded slowly. "Will you come with me? To Ashford Park?" "I think not. I will remain in London and serve as your eyes and ears. Besides, you need time alone to think and to heal. But I will write to you regularly, and you must promise to write back. Do not isolate yourself completely." "I promise." Alexander rose, feeling suddenly exhausted. "Thank you, Aunt Agatha, for listening, for understanding. That is what family is for, my dear." She stood and embraced him, and for a moment, Alexander felt like a child again, seeking comfort from the women who had raised him. Now go home, pack what you need, and leave at first light. The sooner you are away from London, the better. By dawn, Alexander was on the road to Derbyshire, his travelling coach laden with trunks and his most essential belongings. Morrison had organised everything with his usual efficiency, asking no questions but offering quiet support. As the coach rolled through the awakening city and out into the countryside beyond, Alexander watched London disappear behind him and felt something loosen in his chest. The journey to Ashford Park took 2 days. Alexander spent the time staring out the window at the passing landscape, his mind a tumult of anger, humiliation, and a strange, growing sense of relief. Yes, he had been made a fool. Yes, society would talk of nothing else for months, but he was free. Free of Rosalind's deception, free of the suffocating expectations that had nearly led him into a disastrous marriage. Ashford Park rose before him on the afternoon of the second day, its golden stone glowing in the sunlight. The estate had been in his family for 300 years, a sprawling Jacobean manor surrounded by parkland and farms. It was home in a way that Ashford House in London had never been. Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper, who had known him since childhood, greeted him at the door with tears in her eyes. "Your Grace, we heard, that is, the news reached us yesterday. I am so very sorry." "Thank you, Mrs. Henshaw, but I assure you I am quite well. Better than I have been in some time, in fact." And as he walked through the familiar halls of his ancestral home, Alexander realized it was true. The humiliation was real. The anger still burned, but beneath it all was a sense of possibility he had not felt in years. His life was his own again. What he chose to do with it was entirely up to him. 3 weeks passed in quiet solitude. Alexander threw himself into estate business, riding out each day to visit his tenants and inspect his lands. He had always taken his responsibilities as a landlord seriously, but now he found genuine pleasure in the work, in solving problems and improving lives in tangible ways. Letters arrived regularly from Aunt Agatha, filled with news of London. The scandal had been every bit as explosive as anticipated. The Fairmonts had attempted to paint Alexander as unstable, but too many people had been present at the confrontation, and the truth had spread quickly. Rosalind had retired to the family's country estate in disgrace. Charlotte had been withdrawn from society. Lady Fairmont was said to be prostrate with mortification. Alexander felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a weary gratitude that he had escaped. It was in the 4th week of his self-imposed exile that Aunt Agatha's letter brought unexpected news. She was coming to visit, and she was bringing guests, a small party of friends from London, intellectuals and reformers, whom she thought Alexander might find interesting. "You have hidden away long enough," she wrote. "It is time to remember that there is more to life than scandal and society's opinion. These are people of substance, Alexander. I think you will find their company refreshing." Alexander was not certain he wanted company, but he could hardly refuse his aunt. And so, on a warm afternoon in late July, he found himself standing in the entrance hall of Ashford Park, watching as 3 carriages rolled up the drive. Agatha emerged first, embracing him warmly. "You look better," she announced. "Country air agrees with you. Now come and meet my friends." There was Professor Edmund Hartwell, a scholar of political economy from Oxford, Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, a widow who had established a school for working-class children in Manchester, and Dr. Elias Reed, a physician who had recently returned from several years working in India. It was Dr. Reed who caught Alexander's attention immediately. He was a man of perhaps 35, tall and lean, with dark hair touched with grey at the temples and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see everything. There was something about him, a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose, that Alexander found instantly compelling. "Your Grace." Dr. Reed's handshake was firm. "Lady Pemberton has told me a great deal about you. I am honored to make your acquaintance. The honor is mine, Dr. Reed. I understand you have been working in India. That must have been fascinating. It was enlightening, Reed replied, and humbling. There is so much suffering in the world and so much work to be done. As they walked into the house together, Alexander found himself genuinely interested in what this man had to say. And for the first time since that terrible night in the Fairmont Gardens, he felt a spark of something that might eventually become hope. The presence of Aunt Agatha's guests transformed Ashford Park from a refuge into something far more stimulating. Over the following weeks, the house became a hub of intellectual discourse and passionate debate. Professor Hartwell held forth on economic theory during long dinners, arguing for reforms that would benefit the working classes. Mrs. Blackwood spoke eloquently about the transformative power of education, her eyes blazing with conviction as she described the children she had taught to read and write despite their poverty. And Dr. Elias Reed shared stories of his work in India that opened Alexander's eyes to a world he had never truly considered. It was Reed's company that Alexander found himself seeking most often. They fell into a habit of riding out together in the mornings, ostensibly to inspect the estate, but in reality to continue conversations that ranged from medicine to philosophy to the responsibilities of privilege. Reed had a way of challenging Alexander's assumptions without being confrontational, of asking questions that made him examine beliefs he had never thought to question. "You have considerable resources at your disposal," Reed observed one morning as they paused on a hillside overlooking the estate. "Land, wealth, influence. What do you intend to do with them?" "Manage them responsibly," Alexander replied. "Ensure my tenants are well cared for, maintain the estate for future generations." "Noble goals," Reed acknowledged. "But is that enough? You are a duke, Your Grace. You have a seat in the House of Lords. You could effect real change, help people beyond the boundaries of your own lands." Alexander had never thought of his position in quite those terms. He had always viewed his role as primarily custodial, preserving what had been entrusted to him, fulfilling his duties to family and tradition. The idea that he might use his influence for broader purposes was both daunting and oddly exhilarating. "What would you suggest?" he asked. "That depends on what matters to you," Reed said. "What injustices trouble your conscience? What problems do you wish you could solve?" Alexander thought of his mother, of her passion for educating the poor, her belief that every person deserved the opportunity to better themselves regardless of birth. Rosalind had mocked those beliefs, but they had been real and valuable. Perhaps it was time to honor his mother's memory by acting on the principles she had instilled in him. "Education," he said slowly. "Access to medical care for those who cannot afford it. Fair treatment of workers." He looked at Reed. "Is that naive, to think one man could make a difference in such things?" "One man alone, perhaps," Reed replied. "But one man with resources, working alongside others who share his vision, that could change the world, Your Grace." It was during these weeks of intellectual awakening that Aunt Agatha announced her next plan. "You cannot hide in Derbyshire forever, Alexander," she said one evening after dinner. "It has been 2 months since the scandal. The Ton has moved on to newer gossip. It is time for you to return to society." "I have no desire to return to London," Alexander said firmly. "The endless rounds of meaningless social engagements, the superficiality—" "Who said anything about London?" Agatha's eyes twinkled. "I am speaking of Bath. The season there is just beginning, and it attracts a very different sort of person than the London Ton. Intellectuals, artists, people of substance rather than merely fashion. Mrs. Blackwood and Professor Hartwell are travelling there next week for a symposium on social reform. Dr. Reed has been invited to speak at the Royal Mineral Water Hospital about tropical diseases. I thought we might all go together." Alexander hesitated. The thought of facing society again, even Bath society, filled him with reluctance, but he could not hide forever, and the company of his aunt's friends had shown him that not all social interaction was shallow and false. "Very well," he said at last, "but I make no promises about attending balls or assemblies." "We shall see," Agatha said with a knowing smile. They arrived in Bath on a crisp September morning, taking up residence in an elegant townhouse on the Royal Crescent that Agatha had leased for the season. The city was beautiful, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the autumn sunlight, its streets filled with a more diverse and interesting crowd than London ever attracted. The symposium on social reform was held at the Assembly Rooms, and Alexander attended out of curiosity. He found himself fascinated by the speakers, men and women from various walks of life, all passionate about improving conditions for the poor and working classes. During the intervals, he was introduced to reformers, writers, and thinkers whose names he recognized from newspapers and journals. It was at one of these gatherings that he first saw her. She stood near the windows, engaged in animated conversation with Professor Hartwell and two other gentlemen. She was perhaps 25, with dark auburn hair, dressed simply, and intelligent grey eyes that sparkled with enthusiasm as she spoke. She wore a gown of deep green that was elegant but not ostentatious, and there was something in her bearing, a confidence, an authenticity that immediately captured his attention. "Who is that?" he asked Aunt Agatha quietly. His aunt followed his gaze and smiled. "That is Miss Georgiana Winters. Her father is a physician in Bristol, quite progressive in his thinking. She has been working with Mrs. Blackwood on educational initiatives. Brilliant mind, that girl. Come, I shall introduce you." As they approached, Miss Winters looked up, and her eyes met Alexander's. There was no coy dropping of gaze, no affected shyness, just frank, intelligent appraisal. "Miss Winters," Agatha said warmly, "may I present my nephew, the Duke of Ashford? Alexander, this is Miss Georgiana Winters." "Your Grace." Miss Winters curtsied, but there was nothing subservient in the gesture. "Lady Pemberton has spoken of you often. I understand you have been hosting quite the intellectual salon at Ashford Park." "Hardly a salon," Alexander replied, finding himself smiling. "More a gathering of people far more intelligent than myself, from whom I have been learning a great deal." "How refreshing," Miss Winters said, and he could not tell if she was being sincere or ironic. "A nobleman who admits he has something to learn, that is rare in my experience. Georgiana has very little patience with aristocratic pretension," Professor Hartwell interjected with a laugh. "She once told Lord Pemberton, no relation to you, Lady Pemberton, that his opinions on the poor would carry more weight if he had ever actually spoken to a poor person." "I am sure Lord Pemberton was delighted by that observation," Alexander said dryly. "He was not," Miss Winters admitted, her eyes dancing with amusement. "But it was true nonetheless. How can one claim to understand the needs of people one has never met?" "A fair point," Alexander acknowledged. "Perhaps you might help me avoid such ignorance, Miss Winters. I'm genuinely interested in learning more about the educational work you and Mrs. Blackwood are doing." They talked for nearly an hour, and Alexander found himself more engaged than he had been in any conversation since his arrival in Bath. Miss Winters was passionate, but not preachy, knowledgeable, but not pedantic. She challenged his assumptions, but listened to his responses. She was, he realized with some surprise, exactly the sort of person he had been seeking without knowing it. Someone real, someone substantial, someone who saw him as a man rather than a title. Over the following weeks, Alexander found himself increasingly drawn into Bath's reformist circles. He attended lectures at the hospital where Dr. Reed was speaking. He visited the charity school that Mrs. Blackwood had helped establish, and he spent considerable time in Miss Winters' company, discussing everything from political economy to literature to the proper management of estates. It was during one of their conversations, as they walked through the Sydney Gardens on a golden October afternoon, that Miss Winters asked the question he had been dreading. "May I speak frankly, Your Grace? I wish you would. And please, when we are private, Call me Alexander." "Very well, Alexander." She paused on the path, turning to face him. "I have heard the stories about your broken engagement. The entire country has heard them. I do not wish to pry into painful matters, but I find myself wondering, are you here in Bath seeking to escape your past or to build a future?" The directness of the question took his breath away. Rosalind would never have asked such a thing. She would have danced around the subject with careful euphemisms and false delicacy. But Miss Winters, Georgiana, simply asked what she wanted to know. "Both, perhaps," he said honestly. "I came here to escape, yes. But I have found something I did not expect, a sense of purpose, of possibility. Your work, Dr. Reed's work, all of this," he gestured around them, encompassing not just the gardens but everything they represented, "has shown me that there is more to life than duty and obligation, that I might actually do something meaningful with my position." "And what of your heart?" Georgiana asked softly. "Has it healed from the betrayal you suffered?" Alexander considered the question carefully. "I am not certain it was ever truly engaged," he admitted. "I thought I loved Lady Rosalind, but I think I loved the idea of her, the perfect duchess, the ideal wife. I never knew the real woman, and she never wanted me to. What I feel now is not heartbreak so much as anger at my own blindness, and relief that I escaped before it was too late." "Then you are fortunate," Georgiana said. "Many men would have gone through with the marriage rather than face scandal. It took courage to do what you did." "Or foolishness," Alexander said with a rueful smile. "No, courage." She met his eyes steadily. "And I admire you for it." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a connection that Alexander had never felt with Rosalind, despite 3 years of courtship. He realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that this was what he had been seeking all along. Not perfection, but authenticity. Not performance, but genuine feeling. Before he could find words to express this revelation, a familiar voice cut through the afternoon air. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure." Alexander turned to see Lady Charlotte Fairmont approaching along the path, accompanied by an older woman he did not recognize. His stomach clenched. What was Charlotte doing in Bath? "Lady Charlotte," he said coolly, bowing slightly. "I had not realized you were in Bath." "We arrived just yesterday," Charlotte said, her eyes darting between Alexander and Georgiana with barely concealed curiosity. "My aunt, Mrs. Thornbury, has taken a house here for her health. I'm serving as her companion." She turned to Georgiana with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "Miss Georgiana Winters," Georgiana said, her tone polite but reserved. "I am acquainted with Lady Pemberton." "Ah, how lovely," Charlotte said, though her expression suggested she found it anything but. "Your Grace, I wonder if I might have a word with you, in private." "I am afraid I am engaged at present," Alexander said firmly. "Perhaps another time." "It concerns my sister," Charlotte pressed. "Rosalind, she has been quite unwell since the unfortunate events of the summer. I thought you might wish to know." "I am sorry to hear of Lady Rosalind's distress," Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral. "However, her well-being is no longer my concern. Now, if you will excuse us, Miss Winters and I were in the middle of a conversation." He offered Georgiana his arm, and they walked away, leaving Charlotte staring after them with an expression of frustrated malice. "That was the sister?" Georgiana asked quietly, once they were out of earshot. "Yes, she was present during the conversation I overheard. I suspect she has come to Bath specifically to find me, though to what purpose I cannot imagine." "To cause trouble, most likely," Georgiana said. "Be careful, Alexander. A woman scorned, or in this case a family humiliated, can be dangerous." Her words proved prophetic. Over the next week, Charlotte seemed to appear wherever Alexander went. At the pump room, at lectures, at social gatherings. She was always accompanied by her aunt, always perfectly proper, but her presence was clearly calculated to unsettle him. And then came the invitation to the Autumn Assembly, Bath's most prestigious social event of the season. Alexander had planned to decline, but Aunt Agatha insisted. "You cannot let the Fairmonts drive you into hiding again," she said firmly. "You have done nothing wrong. Hold your head high and show Bath society that you are not ashamed." And so, on a cool October evening, Alexander found himself entering the assembly rooms in formal evening attire, with Georgiana Winters on his arm. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that brought out the grey of her eyes, and her hair was dressed with simple elegance. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked real. No artifice, no performance, just herself. The moment they entered, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Alexander felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them, assessing, judging, gossiping. But Georgiana's hand remained steady on his arm, and her expression was serene. And there, across the room, stood Charlotte Fairmont, her face a mask of barely controlled fury, as she watched Alexander escort another woman into the ballroom, where just months ago he should have been celebrating his marriage to her sister. Alexander met her gaze steadily, then turned to Georgiana. "May I have this dance?" "You may," she replied, and smiled at him with such warmth that he felt something in his chest, something that had been frozen since that terrible night in the Fairmont Gardens, finally begin to thaw. As they took their places for the waltz, Alexander realized that he was no longer running from his past. He was walking, deliberately and with purpose, toward his future. And for the first time in his life, that future was entirely his own choice. The waltz with Georgiana marked a turning point in Alexander's reintegration into society. As they moved across the floor, he was acutely aware of the whispers that followed them, the curious stares, the fans raised to conceal gossiping mouths. But he was also aware of Georgiana's steady presence, the intelligence in her eyes, and the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. She did not flinch under society's scrutiny, and her composure gave him strength. When the dance ended, they were immediately surrounded by Aunt Agatha's circle. Dr. Reed, Professor Hartwell, Mrs. Blackwood, and several other reformers and intellectuals who had come to Bath for the season. Their acceptance of Alexander was unequivocal, their conversation stimulating, and within minutes he had almost forgotten the hostile stares from the more traditional members of Bath society. Almost, but not quite. Charlotte Fairmont remained at the edge of his awareness, watching him with an intensity that was distinctly unsettling. She made no attempt to approach him directly, but he noticed her speaking animatedly with several society matrons, her expressions calculated and her gestures emphatic. She was spreading poison, he realized, attempting to salvage her family's reputation by destroying what remained of his. "Ignore her," Georgiana murmured, following his gaze. "She has no power over you unless you grant it to her." "You are right, of course," Alexander replied, "but I confess I find her persistence disturbing. What does she hope to accomplish? Revenge, perhaps, or redemption for her sister, or simply the satisfaction of causing you discomfort?" Georgiana's expression was thoughtful. People who have been humiliated often lash out, even when doing so serves no practical purpose. Over the following weeks, Charlotte's campaign became more overt. She began circulating a version of events in which Rosalind was the innocent victim of Alexander's capricious cruelty, a gentle lady whose heart had been broken by a duke too proud to overlook a minor indiscretion. The story was absurd to anyone who had been present at the confrontation, but Charlotte told it with such conviction that some of Bath's more credulous residents began to view Alexander with suspicion. He might have been more troubled by this if his attention had not been so thoroughly captured by Georgiana. They spent nearly every day together, walking in the gardens, attending lectures, visiting the charity schools where she worked. She introduced him to a world he had never truly known, one where people struggled daily for survival, where children went hungry and sick, people died for lack of medical care. It was humbling and infuriating in equal measure, and it ignited in Alexander a determination to use his wealth and position to effect real change. "You could establish a school on your estate," Georgiana suggested one afternoon as they toured one of Mrs. Blackwood's educational initiatives. "Provide free education to the children of your tenants and the surrounding villages. It would make an enormous difference." "I could do more than that," Alexander said, the idea taking shape in his mind. "I could establish a trust, fund multiple schools across Derbyshire, and perhaps a clinic as well, where Dr. Reed or physicians like him could provide medical care to those who cannot afford it." Georgiana's face lit up with genuine delight. "Alexander, that would be extraordinary. Do you mean it?" "I do." And he realized, as he said it, that he had never been more certain of anything. This was what he wanted to do with his life. Not simply manage an estate and fulfill social obligations, but make a tangible difference in the lives of real people. It was what his mother would have wanted, what she had tried to teach him before her death. "Then I shall help you," Georgiana said firmly. "I have experience in establishing schools, and I know others who can advise on the medical facilities. We can make this happen, Alexander. We." The word resonated through him with unexpected power. When had his plans become their plans? When had this remarkable woman become so integral to his vision of the future? The answer, he realized, was that it had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, over the course of their many conversations and shared experiences. Georgiana had become not just a friend, but a partner in the truest sense, someone who understood his goals, shared his values, and possessed the knowledge and passion to help him achieve them. It was Dr. Reed who finally voiced what Alexander had been thinking but had not dared to articulate. They were riding together one morning in early November, the countryside dressed in autumn colors, when Reed said casually, "You are in love with Miss Winters." Alexander's first instinct was to deny it, but he found he could not. "Is it so obvious?" "To anyone who observes you together, yes." Reed smiled. "And before you ask, she feels the same way. I have known Georgiana for several years, and I have never seen her look at anyone the way she looks at you." "I've only known her for 2 months, Alexander protested. "After what happened with Lady Rosalind, I swore I would not rush into anything." "You courted Lady Rosalind for 3 years and never truly knew her," Reed interrupted gently. "You have known Georgiana for 2 months and understand her better than you understood your former fiancée after years of acquaintance. Time is not the measure of genuine connection, Your Grace. Understanding is." Alexander knew Reed was right. What he felt for Georgiana bore no resemblance to what he had felt for Rosalind. With Rosalind, there had been attraction, certainly, and the satisfaction of having secured an appropriate match. But with Georgiana, there was something far deeper. A meeting of minds, a sharing of purpose, a sense of having found someone who saw him as he truly was, and valued him not for his title, but for himself. "What should I do?" he asked, feeling suddenly uncertain. "What does your heart tell you to do?" "To ask her to marry me. But is it too soon? Will society say I have dishonored Lady Rosalind's memory by moving on so quickly?" Reed laughed. "Lady Rosalind has no memory to dishonor. She is very much alive and, according to the latest gossip, has set her cap at a wealthy merchant in Manchester. As for society, when have you ever cared what society thinks? You broke your engagement in front of 200 witnesses, Your Grace. I think that ship has sailed." Alexander found himself laughing as well, feeling lighter than he had in months. Reed was right. He had already scandalized society beyond redemption. What did it matter if he scandalized them further by proposing to a woman he had known for only 2 months? That evening, there was a small gathering at Aunt Agatha's townhouse, an intimate dinner for their circle of friends. Georgiana arrived wearing a gown of deep burgundy, her hair dressed with amber combs, and Alexander thought she had never looked more beautiful. Throughout dinner, he found it difficult to concentrate on the conversation, his mind occupied with planning what he would say to her. how he would ask the question that would determine his future. After dinner, as the others settled in the drawing room for coffee and conversation, Alexander drew Georgiana aside. "Would you walk with me in the garden? There is something I wish to discuss with you." "Of course," she said, though her expression suggested she suspected what was coming. The garden was small but well maintained, lit by lanterns that cast a warm glow over the paths. They walked in silence for a moment, and Alexander found himself thinking of another garden, another conversation overheard. But this time there would be no deception, no hidden cruelty, only honesty. "Georgiana," he began, then stopped, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. "I am not skilled at this. My previous attempt at courtship was, as you know, a disaster. But I find that with you, I do not wish to play games or follow society's prescribed rituals. I wish only to speak the truth." "Then speak it," she said softly, turning to face him. "I love you." The words came out more bluntly than he had intended, but they were true. "I know we have known each other only a short time, and I know that my reputation is currently in tatters, and I know that marrying me would subject you to considerable scrutiny and gossip. But I love you, Georgiana. I love your intelligence, your passion, your integrity. I love the way you challenge me to be better than I am. I love the future I see when I imagine you beside me, and I am asking, hoping, that you might consent to be my wife." For a long moment Georgiana said nothing, and Alexander felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Had he misjudged? Had Reed been wrong about her feelings? Then she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." The relief that flooded through him was so intense it was almost painful. He took her hands in his, then hesitated. "May I kiss you?" "I wish you would," she replied. And when his lips met hers, Alexander felt the last remnants of his past fall away. This was real. This was right. This was the future he had been seeking without knowing it. They returned to the drawing room, hand in hand, and Aunt Agatha took one look at their faces and began to laugh. "Well, it is about time. I was beginning to think you would never work up the courage, Alexander." "You knew?" Alexander asked, bemused. "My dear boy, everyone knew. We have been waiting for you to realize it yourself." She rose and embraced them both. "I am delighted. Your mother would have adored Georgiana." The announcement of their engagement was made the following week, and the reaction was exactly as Alexander had anticipated, a mixture of shock, disapproval, and salacious gossip. The more conservative members of society were scandalized that the Duke of Ashford would propose to a woman of no particular family or fortune a mere 4 months after breaking his engagement to an earl's daughter. The gossip sheets had a field day, printing lurid speculation about the nature of Alexander and Georgiana's relationship. Charlotte Fairmont's response was the most dramatic. She appeared at Aunt Agatha's townhouse unannounced, demanding to see Alexander. When he reluctantly agreed to receive her, she launched into a tirade. "How dare you?" she spat, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you humiliate my sister and then parade your new fiancé about Bath as if Rosalind meant nothing to you?" "Lady Rosalind meant a great deal to me," Alexander replied coldly. "Or rather, the woman I thought she was meant a great deal to me. The real Lady Rosalind, the one who mocked my mother and viewed me as nothing more than a title and an income, means nothing to me at all. And I would thank you to remember that I was not the one who ended our engagement through deception and cruelty. Your sister did that herself." "She loved you," Charlotte insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "No, she did not, and we both know it. Now, I suggest you return to your aunt's house and cease this campaign of harassment. I wish your family no ill will, but I will not tolerate any further interference in my life." Charlotte left in a fury, but Alexander felt no satisfaction in the confrontation. He simply wanted it to be over, wanted to move forward with his life, and leave the Fairmonts in the past, where they belonged. The wedding was planned for December, a small ceremony in Bath with only their closest friends in attendance. There would be no grand society spectacle, no hundreds of guests, no elaborate celebrations, just a simple exchange of vows between two people who genuinely loved each other. As the day approached, Alexander found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed in the space of 6 months. He had gone from a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making to someone who was truly free. Free to love whom he chose, free to pursue meaningful work, free to live according to his own values rather than society's expectations. On the morning of his wedding, as he stood before the mirror adjusting his cravat, Aunt Agatha appeared in the doorway. "Are you ready?" she asked. "More ready than I have ever been for anything," Alexander replied, and he meant it. The ceremony was held in a small chapel with winter sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Georgiana wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her hair dressed with white roses, and when she walked down the aisle toward him, Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was right. This was real. This was love. As they exchanged vows, Alexander thought of his mother, of the values she had instilled in him, of the life she would have wanted him to lead. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that she would have approved of the choice he had made. When the ceremony concluded and they emerged into the winter afternoon as husband and wife, Alexander felt as though he was stepping into a new world, one filled with purpose, partnership, and genuine happiness. The past was behind him. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility, and he was ready to embrace it. Spring arrived at Ashford Park with an explosion of colour that seemed to mirror the transformation in Alexander's life. The estate, which had felt like a refuge during his exile, had become something far more significant, a home in the truest sense, filled with purpose and shared dreams. 6 months had passed since his wedding to Georgiana, and in that time they had accomplished more than Alexander had thought possible. The Duchess of Ashford was unlike any Duchess Derbyshire had ever seen. She rose early each morning, not to oversee menus and household arrangements, though she managed those efficiently enough, but to work alongside Alexander on the projects they had planned together in Bath. The school they had envisioned was now a reality, a handsome stone building on the edge of the estate where 30 children from tenant families and surrounding villages received free education. Georgiana taught there herself 3 days a week, her enthusiasm infectious as she guided young minds through reading, writing, and arithmetic. The medical clinic had opened in March, housed in a converted barn that Dr. Reed had helped them design. Reed himself had relocated from London to serve as the primary physician, and he had recruited 2 younger doctors to assist him. The clinic provided free care to anyone who needed it, and word had spread quickly. Patients came from miles around, many of them seeing a doctor for the first time in their lives. Alexander spent his days managing the estate with a new sense of engagement. He had implemented reforms suggested by Professor Hartwell: fair wages for labourers, improved housing for tenants, a cooperative system that gave workers a share in the profits from the harvest. Some of his fellow landowners thought him mad, but Alexander did not care. His tenants were healthier, happier, and more productive than ever before. The estate was thriving, and so was he. On a warm May morning, Alexander stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, watching Georgiana lead a lesson on geography. She had a map of the world spread across a large table, and the children clustered around it, their faces bright with curiosity as she described distant lands and different cultures. One small girl, the daughter of his head groom, asked if it was true that people in India rode on elephants. "Some do," Georgiana replied with a smile. "Dr. Reed rode on an elephant once. Perhaps we can convince him to come tell you about it." The children's excited chatter made Alexander smile. This was what his mother had dreamed of: education accessible to all, regardless of birth or circumstance. He wished she could see what they had built here, could know that her values lived on through him. Your Grace." Mrs. Henshaw appeared at his elbow, slightly out of breath. "There are visitors. A carriage has just arrived from London." Alexander frowned. They were not expecting anyone. Did they give their names? "The gentleman said he was Lord Hartley, your grace, and there is a lady with him." Hartley. Alexander had not seen his old friend since before the broken engagement. They had exchanged a few letters, but Hartley had been travelling on the continent for most of the past year. What brought him to Derbyshire now? He found Hartley in the drawing-room, looking travel-worn but cheerful. And with him, to Alexander's surprise, was a young woman he did not recognise. Pretty, dark-haired and visibly nervous. "Ashford!" Hartley bounded forward and clasped Alexander's hand warmly. "My dear fellow, you are looking remarkably well. Country life clearly agrees with you." Hartley, this is an unexpected pleasure." Alexander turned to the young woman. "And you are?" "This is Miss Eleanor Hartley," Hartley said, his chest puffing with pride. "My wife. We were married in Paris 3 months ago." "Your wife?" Alexander could not hide his astonishment. Hartley, the confirmed bachelor who had once declared marriage a trap for fools, had taken a wife? "Congratulations. I am delighted for you both." "As well you should be," Hartley said with a grin. "I have you to thank, in a way. Watching you break free from that dreadful Fairmont woman and find genuine happiness, it made me reconsider my own prejudices against matrimony. When I met Eleanor in Rome, I realized that marriage to the right person was not a trap, but a liberation." Eleanor Hartley smiled shyly. "James has told me so much about you, Your Grace. I hope we are not intruding by arriving unannounced." "Not at all. You are most welcome." Alexander rang for Mrs. Henshaw to prepare rooms for their guests. "My wife is teaching at the school just now, but she will be delighted to meet you both at luncheon." Over the meal, Hartley regaled them with tales of his travels and courtship. Eleanor, it emerged, was the daughter of a diplomat, well-educated and well-travelled, with a quick wit that matched Hartley's own. Georgiana took to her immediately, and soon the two women were deep in conversation about art and literature, while Alexander and Hartley retreated to the study with brandy. "I must tell you, Ashford, the gossip about you has finally died down in London," Hartley said, settling into a leather chair. "Oh, there are still a few old biddies who clutch their pearls at the mention of your name, but for the most part, society has moved on. There are new scandals to occupy them now. I confess I have not given London society much thought," Alexander replied. "We are quite content here. I can see that, and I am glad for it." Hartley's expression grew more serious. "But there is something you should know. It concerns the Fairmonts." Alexander felt a familiar tension grip his shoulders. "What about them?" "Lady Rosalind married last month. A Manchester industrialist named Thornton. Wealthy as Croesus, but common as dirt according to the ton. Apparently she had no other options. Her reputation never recovered from your very public rejection, and no gentleman of quality would have her. Thornton wanted a titled wife to give him social standing, and Rosalind wanted financial security. From what I hear, it is a thoroughly miserable union." Alexander felt a pang of something, not quite pity, but a recognition of wasted potential. "I am sorry to hear it. I never wished her unhappiness." "I know you did not. You are too decent for that." Hartley paused. "There is more. Lady Charlotte has been spreading rumours that you seduced Miss Winters, the Duchess, I should say, while still engaged to Rosalind, that your broken engagement was not about overhearing a conversation, but about your own infidelity." "That is absurd," Alexander said sharply. "I did not even meet Georgiana until 2 months after I ended the engagement. I know that, and anyone with sense knows that. But Charlotte is persistent, and she has convinced a few people. I thought you should be aware, in case the rumours reach Derbyshire." "Let them come," Alexander said with more confidence than he felt. "The people here know the truth. They know Georgiana and the work she does. No amount of malicious gossip can change that." Hartley raised his glass in a toast. "Spoken like a man who has found his backbone. I'm proud of you, Ashford. You have built something real here, something meaningful. That is worth more than all of society's approval." The Hartleys stayed for a week, and their visit brought a welcome energy to Ashford Park. Eleanor was fascinated by the school and the clinic, and she spent hours talking with Georgiana about the possibility of establishing similar institutions on Hartley's estate in Kent. By the time they departed, Hartley had committed to funding a school of his own, inspired by what he had seen. "You are starting a revolution, Ashford," he said as they prepared to leave. "Mark my words, in 10 years, every progressive landowner in England will be following your example." After they left, life at Ashford Park settled back into its comfortable rhythm. Summer brought long, golden days filled with work and companionship. Alexander and Georgiana rode out together each morning to visit tenants and inspect the estate. They dined with Dr. Reed and discussed plans for expanding the clinic. They read together in the evenings, Georgiana curled in a chair by the fire while Alexander worked through correspondence at his desk. It was during one of these quiet evenings in late July that Georgiana set aside her book and said, "Alexander, there is something I need to tell you." He looked up, immediately attentive to the unusual note in her voice. "What is it?" "I am with child." Her hand moved to rest on her still flat stomach, and her eyes were bright with a mixture of joy and apprehension. "Dr. Reed confirmed it this morning. The baby will come in February." For a moment, Alexander could not speak. A child, an heir, but more than that, a son or daughter who would be raised with the values he and Georgiana shared, who would grow up knowing that privilege came with responsibility, that a title was not just an honor, but a call to service. He crossed to her chair and knelt beside it, taking her hands in his. "That is the most wonderful news I have ever received," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have made me happier than I ever thought possible, Georgiana. Every day with you is a gift, and every day with you is an adventure," she replied, smiling through tears. "We are going to build something extraordinary, Alexander. Not just schools and clinics, but a family, a legacy of compassion and purpose." And as autumn painted the Derbyshire hills in shades of amber and gold, Alexander found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he had been a man trapped by expectations, engaged to a woman who despised him, sleepwalking through a life that felt increasingly hollow. The overheard conversation in the Fairmont Gardens had shattered that false existence, and the pain of that shattering had been excruciating. But from those shattered pieces, he had built something infinitely better. He had found genuine love with a woman who challenged and inspired him. He had discovered purpose in work that made a tangible difference in people's lives. He had learned that true freedom came not from rejecting responsibility, but from choosing how to fulfill it. One crisp October morning, as he stood on the terrace of Ashford Park watching the sun rise over his lands, Georgiana joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "About how one overheard conversation changed everything," Alexander replied. "About how the worst moment of my life led to the best. About how grateful I am that I discovered the truth before it was too late. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not gone into the garden that night?" Georgiana asked. "If you had married Rosalind as planned?" "I try not to," Alexander admitted. "The thought is too terrible. I would have been trapped in a loveless marriage, never knowing what I was missing, never finding you, never building this life we have created together." "Then perhaps we should be grateful to Lady Rosalind," Georgiana said with a wry smile. "Her cruelty set you free." "Her cruelty revealed the truth," Alexander corrected, "but it was my choice to act on that truth, to walk away from what was expected and toward what was right. That choice, that single moment of courage, changed everything." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the estate came to life around them. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys as tenants began their day. In the distance, they could hear children's voices as they made their way to the school. The clinic would open soon, and Dr. Reed would begin seeing patients. This was Alexander's kingdom, not the title or the lands or the wealth, but this community of people working together toward a better future. This was what it meant to be a duke, not in the narrow sense that society defined it, but in the truest sense of leadership and service. "I love you," he said to Georgiana, the words still feeling new and precious even after months of marriage. "I love the life we have built together. I love who I am when I am with you. And I love you," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "My duke, my partner, my dearest friend." As the sun climbed higher, bathing Ashford Park in golden light, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace. The whisper he had overheard in a garden had indeed changed his future, but not in the way anyone might have predicted. It had not destroyed him, but liberated him. It had not ended his story, but allowed it to truly begin. He had been given a rare gift, the chance to choose his own path, to build a life based on love and purpose rather than duty and appearance. And he had chosen well. The future stretched before him, filled with possibility and promise, and he was ready to embrace every moment of it. This was happiness. This was home. This was exactly where he was meant to be. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear what resonated with you most. Until next time, remember that sometimes the worst betrayals lead us to our greatest blessings, and true love is found not in perfection, but in authenticity.